briefly just introduce our presenters, but I think they'll give you a little more information when they get on. We have Guy Stevens. Guy started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint to raise awareness and promote legislative change to reduce and eliminate the use of restraint and seclusion. Janae Hanger is the founder and president of the Children's Policy and Law Initiative of Indiana, and she started the Positive School Discipline Institute. And Maggie Raynack. Maggie describes herself as an autistic, bipolar, ADHD, and PTSD disability advocate and a victim of seclusion and restraints. And they'll all be telling you more about themselves as we go through our webinar. So I wanted to start with a little bit of introduction. We know that there's a lot of pathways that lead youth into the youth legal system. And among those, the school to prison pipeline is one of the most egregious. So, we send our children to school to learn, but they often get harmed and criminalized instead. And part of this that we focused on in our recent policy platform is due to mental health challenges that many children face. So I won't go through all of these bullet points, but I have a link to the policy platform if you'd like to read more. And the one we're focused on today is investing in counseling rather than criminalization or harm in our schools. And just briefly, this means investing in trauma-informed, culturally responsive schools. This is building a culture of respect and support, built on a foundation in which all the administrators, all the school staff, teachers know how to recognize and respond to children that have been impacted by traumatic stress, and also are given the tools to cope with extreme situations. And that students are provided with clear expectations and strategies for managing stressful situations. And also it's important for schools to integrate social and emotional learning with culturally responsive practices into their core curriculums. And finally, that school policies be inclusive, not punitive, and trauma-informed. With that introduction, just put my email there if anyone should have questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I'm going to turn it over to Guy Stevens.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So bear with me for 1 second here. And let me get to the presentation mode. And if all has gone according to plan, you should be able to see my screen. If you can give me a thumbs up and let me know. All right, I see a thumb. That's good enough for me. So thank you for the opportunity to join you today. Really excited to be able to come here and share a little bit about what we're doing and really how it connects to the work that you're doing, because I think it connects very tightly. So as was mentioned by Melissa, my name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of a group called the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I also sit on the board of the ARC of Maryland. I'm a member of the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates. More importantly, though, I believe that punitive approaches are leading to a lot of negative outcomes. I believe we can do better for our children and our youth, and I have a strong belief that if we can do better, we must do better. I'm going to talk to you today about restraint and seclusion and how that connects to the punitive approaches that we're seeing and connects to the school to prison pipeline. I'll tell you a little bit about the organization, but we're going to keep this moving pretty quickly because we've got a lot to cover. As I mentioned, I started a group called the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. As you might guess, the focus of that organization has really been on reducing and eliminating practices like restraint and seclusion from schools across the country and even beyond. I'll be honest with you, the first time I heard the words restraint and seclusion in the context of a school, I was somewhat in disbelief. I would never have imagined that kids are routinely restrained and secluded at school. Unfortunately, I learned about this because it happened to my son. My son is neurodivergent. He was restrained and secluded at a school in Maryland. I made a promise to him that that should not have happened and that I would do anything in my power to make sure it didn't happen to him again. Never did I expect that that would lead to me being in front of you here 3.5 years later. I never really intended to start an organization, but that's kind of where life took me. I felt this strong need once I knew what was happening, who it was happening to, and the fact that we can do so much better. I felt a strong need to do something about it. So formed the Alliance about 3 years ago. You can find us on social media. We have a website, which is endseclusion.org. And we've got a lot of people in our community. We've got we've got parents, we've got a lot of self-advocates, a lot of youth, teachers, administrators, attorneys, all sorts of people that are involved in the organization. So I want to give you an overview. Again, some of you may be familiar with the concepts of restraint and seclusion, but I know that I wasn't the first time I heard these terms in relation to a school. So I want to give you a little bit of background, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of restraint and seclusion, and the fact that there are better things that we can and should be doing. So when you think about physical restraint, it's exactly what it sounds like. If you were like me, might not think about it happening in the school, but unfortunately it does. It happens in public schools, it happens in non-public schools, it happens in private schools, happens in residential schools, happens a lot to certain individuals, which we're going to talk about more as we go through this. But a physical restraint is exactly what it sounds like. It's some way of immobilizing another person. So it can be having one or more adult or caregivers holding them. It can be holding them against the ground. It can be holding them against the wall. It can be holding them in a seated position. It's something that, in my mind was more something I would have imagined more often happening in a law enforcement setting, not necessarily in a school. Unfortunately, what I found is it does happen often in schools and other kinds of facilities as well. There are other forms of restraint, such as chemical restraint, and chemical restraint is something more commonly probably associated with the troubled teen industry. But we find often that medications are used to really restrict somebody's movement or actions. These are medications that might not be being used as prescribed by a physician, but they're really for control. They're for behavioral control. And again, when we talk about restraint and seclusion, I guess the first thing to point out here is that these are things that are intended for crisis management. But as I'll explain to you as we go through, I would say they are outdated approaches to crisis management, and they are extremely harmful approaches, both to the people being restrained or secluded, as well as the people that might be doing it. There's also what we would refer to as mechanical restraint. Mechanical restraint is using some kind of device to limit an individual's movement. And the roll of duct tape there in the photograph is not trying to be sensational. In fact, people have been taped to chairs, taped to walls, taped to trees. People have been strapped to chairs. People have been strapped in devices that have medical intent but are not being used in a medical way. One example is a Rifton chair, which is designed for support. However, sometimes we find that kids are being strapped to those chairs inappropriately. So it's any way of using some kind of device to stop someone's ability to move freely. And then we have seclusion. Seclusion, and the definitions I'm using are federal definitions from a guidance document. And the reason that's important is twofold. One, we have no federal law that provides definitions or oversight around the use of restraint and seclusion in schools across the country. What that means is every state has their own set of laws or might not have laws at all around the use of restraint and seclusion. And that's problematic because, as we'll talk about, this is a civil rights issue, a human rights issue, a disability rights issue, and a youth rights issue. But when we talk about seclusion, what we're talking about is the involuntary confinement of someone alone in a room or area from which they are physically prevented from leaving. Now, the photograph there is an actual seclusion room that was taken in Nebraska, but you can see it's a padded room with a small window. And what happens is that a child or a young person may be put in that room against their will, have the door shut, and they aren't allowed to leave. They're told to calm down while it's absolutely a terrifying thing that they're going through. And it's often happening in the name of behavior. Now, we do find sometimes that seclusion rooms have all sorts of interesting names. The name doesn't change the purpose, though. You can call it a reset room, a cool room, a blue room, a break room. But if in fact you're putting someone in there against their will and not letting them leave, the purpose is seclusion. So it would be considered a seclusion room. The other definition I want to mention is the definition of imminent serious physical harm. If you look at federal guidance, again, keeping in mind that we don't currently have federal law, the federal guidance says that you should not use restraint or seclusion unless you have tried everything else possible. It's a crisis situation, and you need to protect the person or others from what they term as imminent serious physical harm. Now, that has a legal definition, and essentially it is a life or death situation. The federal government in their research realized that the impact of restraint and seclusion could be so high that you really don't want to use this unless it's a really high bar. So imminent serious physical harm means a substantial risk of death, extreme physical pain, protracted and obvious disfigurement, or even protracted loss or impairment of a function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. So it's a high bar. You should not be using these things for things that are less serious. Unfortunately, that's what we find. We often find in school settings that kids and youth are restrained and secluded for noncompliance, for disrespect, for minor behaviors, bad language, property damage, sometimes even convenience of the staff. They don't know what else to do, or will say, well, we don't have enough staffing. And that's certainly no reason to traumatize a child. So why is this done? Well, broadly, it's done in the name of crisis management. So there are training organizations across the country that offer training in crisis management. Much of that training involves things like physical holds or restraints. A lot of school districts are required to get training in this kind of crisis management. So we see it happening in schools and hospitals, behavioral programs all across the country. And as I would tell you, it's really an outdated approach. It's outdated for a number of reasons. One, it's very dangerous. Two, there are far better things we can be doing to work with kids and youth proactively to prevent getting here in the first place. What we find is it's often two things that drive it. We have a lot of culture in our schools and other systems around behaviorism and compliance. And what I mean by that is a lot of the approaches taken in our schools are really based on 1930s and 1950s science. It's the science of behaviorism, operant conditioning, reward and consequence. What I would tell you is that we have far better science today. The 1990s were termed the decade of the brain. We learned more about the brain and neuroscience and trauma really from the 90s forward. Yet many of the approaches being taken in our schools are really science that was originally intended on rats and pigeons and dogs. So we have a lot of approaches that are outdated. Also, we've got a lot of culture around compliance. You know, when children are having a difficult time, when youth are having a difficult time, it's all about consequence and compliance. And there's a lot of science behind that that shows that these things are not working. In fact, they often make things far worse and lead to, as Melissa mentioned earlier, kind of that school or prison pipeline. So I want you to understand who this happens to and what the impact is. And what we find is this, of course, does not happen kind of universally across the board to everyone in an equal way. What we find is that certain students are more likely to be restrained and secluded. So if you are a student with a disability, you're far more likely to be restrained and secluded. If you're a Black and brown student, far more likely to be restrained and secluded. Boys are typically more likely to be restrained and secluded, and very young students. So when we're talking about what's going on in our schools, it's not 15 and 16-year-olds more often being restrained and secluded. It's more typically a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old. And if you think about the criteria of use for restraint and seclusion being imminent serious physical harm, the question you have to ask yourself is, how often is a 5-year-old posing the threat of a imminent serious physical harm? I would say that it's not as often as it's happening. And, you know, as a result, you know, we have kids that are being well, I mean, you know, best case scenario, you say it's misguided crisis management. Worst case scenario, it's abusive. And, you know, we have kids that are being repeatedly restrained and secluded. So we also find that kids that are in more restrictive settings are more likely to be restrained and secluded. And something else that might not surprise you is that kids that have a trauma history more likely to be restrained and secluded. When we look at disability, it's really just hard to look at this and not immediately think, wow, this is a civil rights issue. If you look at the data that is collected, and I'll tell you, the data is not very good, but it's the best data that we have. On a federal level, the data shows that 80% of physical restraints are kids with disabilities, 77% of seclusions, kids with disabilities. Meanwhile, the kids with disabilities make up about 13% of the total enrollment of our schools. So you can see there's a significant issue there. As you begin to look at race, you'll find similar disproportionality, that if we look at Black and brown students, far more likely to be restrained and secluded. The next question I wanted to understand was, what is the impact of restraint and seclusion? So when it happened to my son, I knew the impact. he was traumatized. He was afraid to go back to school. We had to get him counseling. We had to get him into what's called a home and hospital program, where a teacher came out to our house to work with him, my son. While he's doing well today, things could have gone far differently. So I wanted to understand what the impact was. And we know the impact is trauma, it's significant injuries, and unfortunately can even be death. This is serious. This is something, there's few things in a school that, when done improperly, could result in the death of a child. Restraint and seclusion is one of them. The first thing to talk about is how the use of restraint and seclusion affects the brain. And, I'm not going to go into this deeply, and you don't have to be a neuroscientist to understand this, but when we are traumatized, it changes our brain. And that's not a metaphoric statement. It's not saying, well, it changes our brain. It means there's actual changes that occur in our brain. And those changes happen to areas like our amygdala and our prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is kind of like our internal alarm system. The amygdala is what notifies us of threat, leads us to fight or flight responses, helps us to protect ourselves if we feel like we're in danger. The prefrontal cortex, of course, is more the executive function and the thinking part of our brain. But what happens is when kids are traumatized, it changes the brain in such a way that it can lead them to be hypervigilant. And this is true of everyone. It's not just true of kids. Anyone that's watching this webinar today that has had a traumatic past, and I'm sure that given the numbers that we have on here, a few of you have been through some trauma. And what you probably know about that trauma is that if you've been through trauma, you're kind of always waiting for the next bad thing to happen. That's what hypervigilance might look like in an adult. In a child, it might mean distress behavior. And that distress behavior can look a lot of different ways. But very often what we find in education is when a child is distressed, having a difficult time, here come the compliance demands. So a child that's already having a difficult time is met with compliance demands. What's that do? It further escalates the situation. It might lead them to a fight or flight state. It might lead them to trying to get away. That may lead them to being restrained and secluded. And what we end up with is a trauma cycle where the more you're doing this to a child, the more likely they are to be hyper vigilant, the more likely they are to again be restrained and secluded. So the impact of trauma is significant. And it's not just the people being restrained and secluded. Those that are witnessing this, it's traumatic. Even those that are doing this, it's traumatic. Somebody that's using restraint and seclusion, they themselves will likely become hypervigilant. That will likely lead them to use this more again in the future as they feel less safe. So there's a tremendous impact of trauma. We, of course, know that there's injuries that happen. Kids have come home with broken bones, head trauma, scratches, bruises, all sorts of injuries that occur in the pursuit of restraining or secluding a child. And it's not just the kids, of course. We know that teachers and staff are injured. A couple of quotes here. I've been punched in the face more times than I can remember. I've been hit in the head with chairs. It's a rare day that you don't get hurt at all. We know injuries happen, and in fact, are more likely to happen when people go hands-on. So we want to avoid any kind of hands-on approach to the greatest extent possible. So things like restraint and seclusion should be rare. Unfortunately, well, I would say seclusion should never exist and restraint should be exceedingly rare. Unfortunately, they're not as rare as they should be. The other thing that we've seen is we have seen over decades now many deaths that have related from kids being physically restrained and even secluded. Cornelius Frederick died, I think it was about 2 years ago. He was in a residential school in Lakeside, Michigan. He was in a cafeteria. He threw a sandwich. He ended up being restrained by several adults for about 12 minutes. It killed him. He's no longer with us. Max Benson in 2018, 13-year-old autistic child, physically restrained, held to the ground, is no longer with us. Angelina Arndt, 7 years old, was held face down in a prone hold, no longer with us. And unfortunately, there are many more. The impact is significant of restraint seclusion. And of course, the other big impact here is if we look at this, what we find is that the kids that are being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, and even in some states still subjected to corporal punishment are far more likely to become disengaged with school. You certainly aren't excited to go somewhere where these things are happening to you. They're far more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system, far more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. And as those of you on this call probably well know, we have prisons that are full of, youth that have been, that we failed. that have not been provided the opportunity they need. We have prisons that are full of individuals with disabilities, dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADD, ADHD, autism. Same stats that we see for restraint and seclusion, we see going down that school to prison pipeline. I do want to hit a couple of myths and misconceptions here real quickly. One is we hear things from people that are doing physical restraints to say restraint is safe. We even hear things like, well, it's safe and therapeutic. We hear things like, well, it's safe if it's performed by trained staff. I've even heard some kids like it. This is, again, intended as a crisis management intervention only in a life or death situation. This is not a hug. This is not something you're doing to a kid that they like. This is something you're doing because you think it has to be done. It is not something that people like. It is something that can be extremely traumatic. And what I would say to you is that the use of restraint is never without risk. Regardless of how much training someone might have, there are always risks. And the reason there are risks are very simple. When you go hands-on with someone, you will escalate them to a point that they will likely go into a fight or flight response mode. When anyone goes into a fight or flight response mode, whether you're 5 years old or you're 50 years old, your body, your blood pressure will increase, your heart rate will increase, your perspiration will increase. You will be ready to fight back to survive. And when that happens, there's no more safety. There's no safety when individuals are in a fight or flight response mode. So restraint is not something that can be done safely because the impact will result in individuals moving into that fight or flight response as a survival instinct. We also hear things like, well, seclusion rooms, they help kids calm down. So sometimes a kid needs a quiet space to self-regulate. Now, again, think about the circumstances here. You are putting them against their will in a room or area, and you are preventing them from leaving. So you are forcing them in the space. You are holding the door shut. There is nothing at all that is regulating about that. It's terrifying. A kid may go in that room and they may beat, scratch, try to get out. They may take their clothing off. They may urinate. They may do a lot of things. These are trauma responses. They're not regulating responses. What sometimes people see is that after 15 or 20 minutes, the kid seems to kind of melt into the back of the wall. They kind of slouch down, their head goes down. This is not a kid calming down. This is a kid who is entering a brain survival state and possibly even a dissociative state where their brain is turning off. It is trying to prevent them from further damage. It is nothing calming about that at all. We also hear things like, this is our only option. You know, what else do you expect us to do? We have to protect other students. We have to protect against self-harm. And the truth is today, there are many other options. There are many better things we can be doing. I'd be happy to come back and talk more about those, but there are a lot of better things we can do to better support kids, to proactively support kids, and to alleviate the need for these kinds of interventions. I did want to mention here, currently there is no federal law that provides oversight around this, although there has been efforts made around this for well over a decade. We can go back to 2009. Our Government Accountability Office did a report in 2009. Look at the title of this report. It really is something that makes you think. Selected cases of death and abuse at public and private schools and treatment centers. Let that sink in for a second. How in 2009 did we have this report? Did we have all this attention and yet nothing got done to stop it? It's absolutely amazing to me that these things have continued to happen. In 2012, the Department of Education came up with a resource document, they called it, on restraint and seclusion. This was their best idea of the policies that local school systems should adopt to try to reduce the likelihood of the need for restraint seclusion. And what they say in this document is that every effort should be made to make sure that you don't need to use restraint seclusion. But in that situation that involves that imminent serious physical harm, where you have tried other things and they have not been successful, that's the only circumstance under which you might consider using these things. They provided a number of principles, 15 principles about the use of restraint seclusion. Now, a decade later, some states have adopted many of those principles, some have not. So it's very uneven if you look across the United States. We do have a current bill called the Keeping All Students Safe Act in Congress and in the Senate. Currently, that bill has over 100 co-sponsors. While we're hopeful that that legislation might pass, I'll also tell you that for over a decade, there has been effort to pass laws like this. Any of you that are interested in this, might want to get in touch with your state level representatives who are your federal representatives and ask them to support a bill like this. This would ban the use of seclusion, ban prone and supine restraint, which can prohibit breathing. It would add training to help people move away from these practices. And as I mentioned, there's a kind of a patchwork of state laws across the country, and these aren't keeping kids safe. You know, if you look at what's happening, it wouldn't be happening like it was if these laws were working. This is a civil right. It should not vary from state line to state line. So as I travel from my home state of Maryland into Virginia or into Pennsylvania, the laws that protect my son or anyone should not be different. So there are better ways. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail here, but what I would say to you is that we're very supportive of what we would call trauma-informed approaches that understand the impact of trauma and try to build culture around better supporting children and youth. We're also in alignment with kind of neuroscience-based approaches, understanding the brain and how the brain works and how it responds to stress. We're also supportive of relationship-driven approaches. There's probably nothing more therapeutic and healing than the right relationships, and collaborative approaches. We need to stop doing things to children and youth and begin working with children and youth. So again, lots more that I could go into there, but in the sake of time for today, I want to move into talking about shared experience. And Maggie is going to be joining us, and I'm going to unshare my screen here in a second, but I'll introduce Maggie. Maggie is an autistic, bipolar, ADHD, and PTSD disability advocate and a victim of seclusion restraint. Maggie is now a volunteer with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Her goal is to bring more awareness about the dangers and deadliness of seclusion and restraint through art and writing, and encourage others to speak up. So let me unshare my screen here, and we'll let Maggie take over and share a few minutes from her experience.
Okay, so I'm Maggie. I'm a victim of seclusion restraint in Ohio. I was seclusion restrained for a span of 10 years. It happened at like 10 different schools. It happened every day for like up to 3 hours. I was locked in a seclusion room, and I would often be like dragged in there very violently by my hair, by my clothes, body, legs, arms. And I don't ever remember why I was there. All I remember because I blocked out a lot of that. How I tried to, there was one day I was at a school in Columbus. It was, we had been, me and another student had been seclusion restrained many times, almost every day that year for at least a few months since they got the new teacher in. And so they had this closet, the storage room that wasn't being used at all. It was literally, they had the door taken off. Well, they put the door back on, and it ended up becoming a way to seclude children. So one day I was being secluded and restrained. When they put me in there, I tried to stop the door from being closed. So I ended up, and in the midst of it, my hand got bruised and stuck underneath the door. And it was bruised for like 5 months. The nurse did report to my mom. So we had this like report there. My mom won't tell me if it was recorded or not. I was 10 at the time, by the way. Next day, I didn't want to get into the car, so because I wanted my mom to pick me up instead, because the bruise had gotten worse. I wanted her to take me to the hospital instead of going to my dad, who was not the nicest. And then they tried to pick me up and push me into the car. And when I wouldn't budge, they dropped me on the ground really hard. I was crying, screaming, kicking. And a teacher from another classroom came over and pinned me on the ground with her knee on my chest where I couldn't expand my chest. And I kept screaming, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And they ended up, my sitter actually came out, was gonna take me to my dad's. She had to, but it was like, she came out and she basically said, "That's my kid, get off of her." And like, that was one of those times where like, you just think to yourself, am I gonna die today? Because you don't know, like, it's scary. And I think about what Max Benson went through and how similar it probably was. And it scared me because now I think about, could I have died that day if my sister hadn't been there? And so we had like a bunch of legal investigations, nothing happened out of that. A few how it impacted me was that because I was actually secluded and restrained a lot afterwards, at different schools. So next school I kind of went to, I had a lot of seclusion restraint with schools afterwards too. But when I was 12, I started to really feel how terrible it really was, because I actually was in a seclusion room. I was having to write a letter to a bully to apologize to her. I can't remember why, but then I picked up the pencil and stabbed myself with it. I still have a scar from it. And I remember just thinking that day, I'd rather be anywhere else but here. I'd rather be, I don't care if I'm dead, I just want to be away. And it was really scary. Like, and that the only thing I took out of it really was that I should be labeled as violent. That I should just be, punished for being myself. I also learned that I also learned something with a lot of the trauma, because I was actually I'm disabled. I also had a lot of trauma from like my childhood, early childhood. I was first secluded restrained at 6 years old, and it just kind of continued on. But one thing I really took away from it was, if you notice, I don't express much emotion in my face. That's because I've had to be strong for so many years to get through it, that I just, I guess I just get tired. I get exhausted from it. And you just say, if you feel like you can't ever feel weak, you can't ever be vulnerable, because it's just, people can take advantage of that. And that's embarrassing to feel vulnerable. And so you're just strong, and it wears you out like crazy. And that's one thing I've also noticed. I'm actually now diagnosed with complex PTSD, which I'm actually kind of self-diagnosed, but like kind of diagnosed with PTSD, since complex PTSD is the common one out to people who are secluded and restrained go through, but it's not actually in the DSM. But it has a lot of symptoms that correlate to that.
Maggie, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know how difficult it is to share, but I think it really is meaningful for people to understand the impact. And as I said, Maggie is a volunteer with the Alliance and has been helping to bring about change. And I think it's really important to have perspective of people that have been through through these things to be able to help us bring about change. So Maggie, thanks so much. And with that, Melissa, I think we'll hand it back over to you if there's any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maggie. I'm sorry for what you had to go through. It sounds horrible, and I appreciate your sharing the story to help keep this from happening to other children. I think it's very powerful.
When Guy was going through the slides, I could feel my heart rate elevating, actually.
Yeah, I'm sure. And thank you, Guy, also for your presentation. I think we had one question here. I'm trying to scroll back through. So early on, Guy, during your presentation, somebody asked if it's seclusion, if there is observation, or if there is one person in the room with the child.
So in most cases, seclusion spaces have an observation window of some kind. And usually that's part of the practice, is that people have to keep an observation on the child. There was a point where that wasn't happening and really bad things were happening to kids in those rooms. So it's typically part of the law, but it still is seclusion, regardless of the fact that somebody is watching, if they're in there kind of alone against their will. Now, the question about if there's someone else in the room gets into a little bit of a challenging area. What I would say to you is that we see cases, for instance, where a child is forced into a room, someone that's aware of the law and might be perhaps trying to get around the law, rather than shutting the door, will use their body to prevent egress. So they become the door. They prevent the child from leaving by becoming the door. I would tell you that, in my opinion, that would be seclusion. I've talked to attorneys that would argue that as well. It gets a little bit more complicated when you begin talking about, okay, well, the door's shut, the child's not allowed to leave, but there's an adult in the room. This gets a little complicated, but what I would say to you is, if the adult's only function in that room is to prevent the child from leaving, if the adult is practicing planned ignoring or some other kind of practice where they're not trying to help a child that's escalated, they're only trying to contain them, I would consider that to be seclusion, but that would come to a state by state, kind of legal area. In fact, there's sometimes kind of a gap between what's called exclusion and what's called seclusion. And exclusion, somebody might be separated with an adult, but the doors aren't locked. They're not prevented from leaving. So the moment you cross over into shutting the door and preventing them from leaving, it's coming very close to being seclusion. But there are many things that people do to try to get around what the laws might be. And that's something I witnessed just recently. A student that was being shut in a room, told they couldn't leave, the door was being shut, and the adult was in there only to prevent them from leaving. I consider that to be seclusion, but from a legal standpoint, it really depends on what the laws say and what somebody might be able to argue successfully.
Thank you. And one last question is, let's see, looks like is there a way to find out if a school or state uses seclusion and restraint, and if you have any resources you can share?
Yeah, so the first part of that answer is that every state, unfortunately, uses minimally restraint. We do have states that have banned the use of seclusion. Those states, Hawaii was one of them. Georgia was one. Georgia passed legislation after a young man hung himself in a seclusion room. We've got, I think, 6 states now that ban the use of seclusion. No states that have banned the use of physical restraint. A couple places you can go to find information. The first is the Office of Civil Rights has a civil rights data collection, and information on restraint and seclusion is reported to OCR every 2 years. Now, the thing I'll tell you is that data is not the best, but it might be the only data you have. Some states have state level reporting requirements. So I live in one. Maryland has state level reporting. We have to report each year to our General Assembly. So that data is available. In OCR, you can look it up by school district or by school. So if you were looking for a specific school, I will tell you it goes vastly underreported. Even the reports that might be generated, for every report that's generated, there might be 5 or 10 that aren't, if not more. I can even tell you from personal experience, many of the cases with my son were not officially reported. They never even used the words restraint seclusion the first couple of times it was done to him. Was that, did I get both parts of the question? I know there were 2 parts there. Did I get everything there?
I think so.
Okay.
And we're going to go on to Janae now, but I will tell folks that I can follow up, individually if you had questions that didn't get answered.
Yeah, and I did see somebody asked about alternatives. I'm going to put a link in the chat with some alternative approaches, but I would also welcome anyone to reach out to our organization or to reach out to me, and happy to have discussions along those lines as well.
Great. Thank you, Guy.
Yep.
Okay. Whoop, muted myself. Okay, so it's helpful to hear about positive ways we can work on discipline in school and work on helping children. So we invited Janae Hanger to speak about a program that she started in Indiana that has a much more positive approach to children.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you, Guy, for that presentation, and Maggie for sharing your story. I think that Guy's presentation and Maggie's story really kind of helps you understand why we are doing what we are doing in Indiana to try to get rid of practices that actually create trauma. And so we have been trying to pivot as a state. I got to say that we're nowhere where we need to be, for sure. The Children's Policy and Law Initiative of Indiana has been working both on public policy reform and changing laws, trying to get more resources to support prevention, early intervention, culturally responsive practices, and trauma-informed practices. And we have also been trying to impact practices specifically at the local level. And I think that gets you to the Positive School Discipline Institute. I want to say first, what we have found about schools is that, we really need to talk about the culture and the mindsets in schools. You rarely have just one problem in a school. You rarely have just, seclusion and restraints without a lot of other things going on. I would offer that you probably have other indicators that there is something horribly wrong in the school, like a lot of exclusion, a lot of suspensions, disproportionality, racial disparities, school-based arrests. And so the Positive School Discipline Institute, if I backtrack just a little bit about who we are, the Children's Policy and Law Initiative of Indiana is a member of NJJN. We've been working on public policy, advocacy, and reform in the state of Indiana for the last 10 years. We've developed quite a network of about 2,000 people. Many are active volunteers. We collaborate and partner with universities and other organizations, nonprofits, but we're also involved at the state level in juvenile justice reform, actively working in our Commission on Children and the Juvenile Detentions Alternative Initiative. So we have multiple ways we try to influence particular issues that are impacting our children. But I think at the root of our work is that systems should not create trauma. And quite frankly, when you look at systems, really all our systems need to be overhauled to become trauma informed. So anyway, maybe we can move on to this is our mission statement. Basically, our focus is on equitable, fair, and humane practices with children that are age and developmentally appropriate. We actually leverage our resources in this state. So like I said, we have a lot of coalitions and collaborations. We don't just work on one issue. We've been working on school discipline reform for the last 10 years, as well as working on deep end changes in laws that tend to criminalize our kids. But we realize that we've got to shrink that system, and you can't ignore how one system impacts another system. And so ultimately, we've got to end the school to prison pipeline. In order to do that, we've formed a network, the Indiana Youth Justice Coalition. We have over 60 organizations that belong at this point, with every intention of increasing it. We have another coalition which is focused on comprehensive student supports, and we've got 20 organizations as part of that, including school counselors, school social workers, school psychologists, and school nurses. So we're working to increase the kinds of supports and services we need in schools, as opposed to trying to put those more negative strategies in place, as you would find by over relying on school police or seclusion and restraint. And finally, we've been working through the Commission on Children and actually head up a group that is working on child psychological maltreatment. Corporal punishment is an issue under that particular group. Developmentally appropriate justice responses. We're looking very closely and trying to advocate for change on minimum age for prosecution, because quite frankly, in Indiana, you have no minimum age, and that is a big door that children go through from schools into our justice systems. Next slide, please. What the Positive School Discipline Institute is, we started that about 4 years ago. It is a 9-month training initiative It jumpstarts teams in schools. So it's multidisciplinary teams that are led by their principal. And the idea is that we need to really have a leadership team form that can research and understand research and best practices, gain that foundational knowledge about what are best practices and what works with kids, and then provide them with some tools in place that they can start to make those changes and change their culture, and hopefully bring their entire staffs along at changing mindsets. Like I said, ultimately this training, it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's really trying to get to attitudes and changes and belief systems. Because if you don't change those things, you're not going to make a lot of progress. Next slide. So part of that, we do have multiple training days. We bring in experts who train on culturally responsive practices, trauma-informed practices. We train on adolescent development, strategies, classroom management strategies that are effective. We train by role, policies, policies and practices, school policy, school discipline policy. What kinds of policies are driving those kinds of results that end up with kids being excluded or being not welcome in school? So we train administrators, we train teachers, and we train law enforcement. We believe law enforcement, we do not actually encourage law enforcement being operating in schools, because I think all the research is saying that, quite frankly, who are we policing? Are we policing to protect the children, or are we policing the children themselves? And so there's a lot of things, though. I know Indiana's like every other state, that door was opened a long time ago. And so with that fact that we do have police in schools, it's critical to get appropriate training for those police. And so we've worked both at the state level in passing laws that require training, and also developing a model that incorporates them in to a positive learning environment. I think it's really important to have I think a hallmark of the trauma-informed school is that adults in the community recognize and respond to those who are impacted by traumatic stress. And if you have to have that foundational knowledge about what does work. And you also have to develop skills around those adults where they themselves are regulated. Because if you have a dysregulated adult, you cannot have a regulated child. And oftentimes, educators will take things personally instead of really understanding, what is the root cause of behavior, and what is that situation of that particular student that is causing those behaviors to occur, so they can effectively deal with it. So this is really, I think, a basic principle that underlies the Positive School Discipline Institute. Next slide, please. When I say the trauma-informed school model, in Indiana, we actually built our model around a principal who's a national trainer now. He was featured in Paper Tigers. Many of you may be aware of Paper Tigers. Jim Sporleader. He's actually an international resource on trauma-informed schools. He's produced a book, and he has just basically trained all across the country. It was his work in Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, Washington, where he was able to implement trauma-informed practices, and he was able to reduce suspensions by 90%. School-based arrests went down. Their academics went up in every subject category. And within a couple of years, they actually had a higher graduation rate than Washington State as a whole. And this was an alternative education high school. And when you're familiar with alternative ed, I mean, these are children with the highest needs. Next slide, please. So 3 years of school teams being trained through PSDI, we have now trained 54 school teams. Several of those schools have had pretty dramatic drops in suspension. Now, I can't say every school that we have trained has encountered the same results. It really depends on the commitment of the school and what they put into it. And I think once you start going down this road, you usually, the larger the school system, the more you have to push professional development out. And it takes time. It's not something that you can just get rid of zero tolerance overnight. So really bringing your staffs along with principals in a leadership position is what you have to have done. So early on, the first year we were training teams, we decided we had to develop a train the trainer program. What we were hearing from schools is that you cannot, they just don't have the time to develop the resources based on training, how to train others. And as a result, we partnered with Jim Sporleader and we developed 9 modules that basically track the trauma-informed school model, but we also applied a culturally responsive lens to it. We engaged local trainers here who train on culturally responsive practices and implicit bias to apply that lens to what we were developing on trauma. Next slide, please. Why do we think it's so important? Early on, we began working on school discipline, and we realized that the numbers are off the charts. Most people do not understand, especially in urban schools, the numbers of children who are being suspended. And again, I think that's a major indicator that there's something wrong in those school environments. What we were finding in Marion County schools, which is where Indianapolis is located, is that a third of the schools were suspending 10% or more of their student population a year. And it ranged all the way up to 90% about 4 or 5 years ago with certain charter schools. Over time, we still see about a third of the schools suspending. However, the numbers have actually gotten better. The top tier is no longer 90%, it's more like 50%. So are we making an impact across the board? We still have a lot more to do. And as you know, just one suspension can increase the risk of failure, academic failure, and also entry into the juvenile justice system. Next slide, please. Indiana data. I mean, if you start looking at just the indicators around children and that implicate trauma, you understand that this is just essential training in schools. Next slide. And we also can look at our data from the juvenile justice side as well. I mentioned that minimum age for prosecution is a very important issue that we really need to get a handle on, because ultimately, as long as we allow the juvenile justice system to be our answer for children under the age of 12 who are perceived to be uncontrollable, we will not develop the resources that we need to create pathways for their success. And so this is an issue that we take that is very important. And I think if you look at our data, because we do have the Council of State Governments working in Indiana, you see a sizable number of referrals are coming in under the age of 12. It's a real issue that we need to get control of. And you can also see the disproportionality. Race and disabilities play a huge role in school discipline. Next slide. So with the pandemic, we realize there's a lot more resources, federal and state, to address this kind of training. There's really no excuses anywhere that this training can't happen. Indiana, unfortunately, some of you may be aware, as states across the nation, red states have been trying to basically control curriculum, really trying, they're called anti-CRT bills. We had one in our state that actually also targeted SEL It was a reaction to much of the work that we've been doing over the last decade. And so this particular year, we had to defeat, which we did. I can announce that we did defeat that bill. Doesn't mean it's not going to come back next year, but these kind of resources are just critical for schools. And we know from the pandemic that trauma is off the charts in our communities around children. Next slide, please. Again, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, 1 out of 4 children. This was before the pandemic occurred. It was estimated 1 out of 4 children have some kind of event that can affect learning or behavior. It's how people respond to that trauma. It is not a given that these kinds of bad things have to happen that you see on this slide. It's really how do we respond, and are we training adults to understand and use different strategies? Next slide. Again, here's a list of the impact of trauma. These are the long-term consequences when we don't intervene, when we don't, emphasize that we've got to change cultures and mind shifts in schools. So the training topics that we've developed, these are just a short list of them. Obviously, we've been talking about it through this hour. These are the both at the training by role and also through our master training program, we focus on these kinds of strategies. Some of the topics, as far as school discipline is concerned, these are the kinds of strategies you really need to be employed. It's not one strategy, quite frankly, and there has to be an investment by schools to really turn both their practices and their policies around. School policing, same thing. We're not going to get rid of school policing, I think, in this decade, at least not in Indiana. And I think that there's a lot of states that would probably say that's true. We can't just dig our heads in the sand and say it's going to be okay. We have to create a regulatory framework around school police. We have to train them on adolescent development and de-escalation. And we have to put policies in place that prohibit what they can and cannot do in schools. And ultimately, we've got to be asking, are there crisis teams in place that have the professional skills to deal with crisis so that we don't end up secluding and restraining, and we don't end up having a law enforcement officer intervene and order compliance, which ultimately may end up in an arrest of a child. Next slide, please. Anybody that's interested in what we have been doing here as far as training schools, we're happy to share more information. There are national resources for your state that can help you, move forward in this area. I'm happy to connect you with those as well. So I don't know if there's any questions in the chat, but I'm happy to share whatever resources we can with people who are interested.
Thank you, Janae. I really appreciate your presentation, and we are 1 minute before 4, but I'll ask you one quick question somebody asked, which was that whether in-school suspension is something you think a school should use.
I think it has to be a last resort. I think suspension should be rarely used, if ever. There are other approaches that can be much more effective, and quite frankly, most of the time is prevention. If we change cultures around school and we change engagement of young people, you're going to find that a lot of in-school suspension doesn't need to occur. So I hate getting locked into a box saying, okay, without really focusing on what needs to be changed so that we can lower those numbers.
Great, thank you. So I want to be mindful of people's time. It's 4 o'clock now. We'll try to get responses to some of the questions we weren't able to answer today. And I just want to thank everybody, our participants. Thank you for coming to this webinar, and our presenters, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. And That's it. I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you.